Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Crit Hit Reviews with your host, Arlyeon. On today's episode, I'll be talking about Neopopcorn Corp's action-oriented Metroidvania, 3000th Duel. Find out if I thought this title was fated for success or due for an early finish. Ahem. A warrior wakes in a forest, lacking any memory of the past, and the only guidance they receive is a mysterious voice which whispers to them. What awaits them is a ruined kingdom rife with monsters, and the faint hope that some answers await them in the end. In execution, players introduce the story in slivers, with sporadic bits of instruction from a mysterious disembodied voice goading them to press onwards in their, generally homicidal-riddled quest, which, to be fair, wasn't exactly the clearest instruction at the best of the times. Whilst there are some chunks of lore about the bosses that you encounter, which at least somewhat explain who they were, they tend to be short snippets you earn after you've cleared them, and which much of the time seem to hold little bearing on what you were doing at large. It never quite managed to drag me into the story, and the bits of dialogue provided by the NPCs didn't really manage to clarify much either. What's more, the climax of the game provided a big bad that was deeply unsatisfying on a narrative level, not only because I was given little reason to care about him, but also because of the note the game ends on. And maybe some of these might be due to nuance being lost in the sometimes squint-inducing character dialogue, or the snippet of lore and items, but I'm really thinking not in regards to that ending. That said, I did find 3000th Duel a fair bit more straightforward in its nature as a Metroidvania, with RPG elements. As a player, you're tasked with gradually exploring a fairly large map in search of where to go next, while very gradually acquiring new abilities and items to both navigate the world and engage in combat. It's a tried and true formula, and one that I actually appreciate a fair bit in Duel's case, because it provided you a map that only marks objects of interest in a legend that's readily discernible at a glance. It also provides you the ability to freely mark down areas of interest in case you're suspicious about certain areas or want to revisit a spot once you have a relevant item or think it's important. Frankly, it made finding the optional bits a lot easier than a lot of its peers within the genre, though there were times where I was briefly wandering about trying to remember where exactly I should be going, as the game's generally a hands-off experience in regards to telling you what to do. More or less, it expects you to roam about and explore to a rather thorough degree if you intend on finishing the game. Also, just backtracking a bit to the notes, you only get the one type, though. It's just a little X you can put on the map, so you can't actually put down different kinds of marking and be like, this is the type of thing I'd like to go, or this is... So, it's good. It is very helpful. It is way more than a lot of games give you. It still could be better. But honestly, all given that it sort of emphasizes exploration, it's really not necessarily a bad thing within the genre, and I did find myself enjoying the overall challenges I came across, both in regards to the environmental hazards, as well as the various enemies that I could butt heads with. That said, I also became duly aware that it was entirely possible to make the game harder for yourself. For one thing, while some of your power comes from the weapons, accessories, or the additions to your repertoire ability-wise, a larger portion comes from the game's statting system. A system which a player is wholly capable of unwittingly making terrible mistakes with, well, besides the risk of failing to spend their karma/souls at the nearest save point or mid-game merchant and losing it all when they die. And the reason I say this is because the choices players make with their stats are permanent. There is, in fact, no way to respect them as of the writing of this review. Whilst the stat system is relatively straightforward, even if feeling out where the soft caps of stats are might not be, there also exists a far more complex ceiling stone system. This latter system is where you can really screw up, as it allows players to gradually fill in a skill tree of passive abilities, with more of it becoming accessible as they discover core abilities, as well as spend enough ceiling stones in a given tier so they may access the next one. That said, not only does this leave players making decisions which impact their endgame near the beginning, without any clear idea of how many ceiling stones they'll actually acquire from both exploration and leveling, they're unable to respect this system either, and decisions in here will very much lean a player toward what kind of weapon they will ultimately settle on. So, essentially, players are able to grievously mess up these skill systems fairly easily, especially when the actual gains you're acquiring from the Sealing Stone abilities aren't very clear on a mechanical or even descriptive level. Like, yes, you get an explanation of what it does, somewhat, but the exact bonuses any ability give you is hazy for the most part. You get a bonus to your mortal blows. It doesn't tell you what the bonus is, how much either raw or percentage damage is, it's just you get a bonus. So it makes measuring which choices are optimal in comparison to their peers a bit of a nuisance, especially when you factor in that inability to redo and experiment. And then all of this is further complicated by the weapon upgrade system. That's right, we're getting layers to how badly we can screw things up. See, whilst you can purchase low-tier items to upgrade your weapons and spells, anything towards the mid or high tier is incredibly limited, and I never had them drop off anything, which meant it was entirely possible to mess up on your choice of weapon or spell upgrade choices, which can hurt a lot while you're still trying to figure out what style of weapon you mesh with, and not really realizing this near the middle of the game, that even this middle grade stuff doesn't grow on trees. I'll also admit that this vagueness played a factor in measuring the worth of certain gear items, since there's a number which seem to hold no real discernible use despite their item descriptions. Looking at you, Mana Charging Ring, or just how much the crit enhancing items impacted your playstyle. What's more, while there were a number of weapons which carried some neat elements like elemental damage and status effects, I never found a boss vulnerable to status effects, which generally made them a less interesting choice in face of any weapon which inflicted raw damage. And while there are minions who encounter that are vulnerable to these effects, they generally don't have the sheer amount of health to make them noteworthy, save for a few rare instances. That's not to say I didn't enjoy the boss at large, since I looked forward to butting heads with them a great deal, as there was a decent amount of variety, and they generally felt fairly accessible. Learning their phases was also a bit of necessity on my point, given that my complete neglect of health also meant I permanently resided in one-shot territory for them. Yeah, that's part of where I was like, well, I can't respec, I guess I'm just committing to this bad choice. But anyways, really, my only grievance with any of the larger encounters was the fact that they combined bulky enemies, who were not only fairly aggressive and hard to dodge around, but also did contact damage even if you were behind them. Thankfully, the contact damage isn't anything like their attack damage, but it's still intensely frustrating for a number of the fights, and in fact, the only reason I didn't manage to perfect kill a number of the later bosses is strictly because I bumped into them. Anyways, so let's talk aesthetics, and what I'm seeing here is dark fantasy, but let's give them a sort of cutesy design complete with oversized heads. There's not really a design aesthetic I would have thought I'd be describing to folks, but here we are. That's not to say it looks bad, but 3000th Duel has a distinct and altogether weirdly adorable vibe to its world, which can be a bit jarring at times when you realize you just finished fighting the flaming skeletal remains of someone who was shackled and burned alive for what would have been eternity before you stabbed him to death. Yeah. You're mixing dark fantasy and my adorable, and it's weird. Anyways. Sound design wise, though, I certainly don't mind things, but in the face of the peculiarity of the visuals, I can't really say anything overly stuck out to me. But anyways, let's boil all of this down, shall we? Ultimately, I won't say that 3000th Duel is going to astound you with its narrative strength, as even now, the story element I happen to be the most invested in was the well-being of a ferocious but ultimately endearing masked wolf, who, by the by, I ultimately remained fairly clueless about even after having reached the climax of the game's story. Nonetheless, where the overall plot may have stumbled to really entice me forward, I did find that the gameplay experience was a bit more compelling, enough so that I was able to coax me to continue forward even after making a large number of hilarious but regrettable decisions. Really regrettable decisions. But, sure, even now I can say there are elements that I generally wished were a bit more refined, well-defined, or even just a bit more flexible in regards to systems in place for 3000th Duel. And yet, despite these faults, I was still left with a thoroughly enjoyable and genuinely challenging game to explore and conquer. Frankly, it was, and remains, charming enough as an entry that I'd consider it a hit, albeit on tentative grounds at times. That said, if you're looking for a gameplay-focused experience, it can certainly provide, and there is a lot to ultimately unearth if you need something to occupy your attention for a while. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And for those interested in more indie reviews, developer interviews, podcasts, or our Monday TTRPG content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. There's also a Discord. You can click the link in the banner or description if you're a part of our community, the Crit Hit Cauldron. Lastly, if you'd like to help support the channel, we do have a coffee running now to help supplement funds for a lovely editor, and to make sure we can continue to provide quality content. Again, check the description and the banner for them links. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.